The afternoon sun cut low across the Charlottenburger Chaussee, throwing long shadows beneath the Brandenburg Gate. It was September 7th, 1945, and Berlin, or what remained of it, was hosting a victory parade unlike any the war had produced. Marshal Zhukov stood on the saluting dais. Beside him, in pressed khaki, Field Marshal Montgomery and General George Patton flanked the Soviet commander, their faces composed in the polite mask of inter-allied courtesy. Then the engines came. British observers scattered through the reviewing party and tucked discreetly into the press of military attachés had expected the usual procession. T-34s, self-propelled guns. The workmanlike armour that had ground its way from Stalingrad to the Reichstag. What rolled past instead made several of them, by their own later admission, stop taking notes mid-sentence. 52 heavy tanks, low, brutal, unmistakably new. The hull was a single sloped wedge of cast steel. The turret was a flattened hemisphere. No shot trap, no vertical surface for a shell to bite into. A long 122mm gun jutted from the mantlet like an accusation. The Soviet press would soon name it the Iosif Stalin III. To the small knot of British officers watching from a balcony 2 streets away, it had no name at all yet. It had only a silhouette, and that silhouette was a problem. One of those officers was a major from the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, the unit Whitehall had quietly tasked with combing the ruins of Germany and increasingly the conduct of the Red Army for technical surprises. He had glimpsed the type in grainy reconnaissance photographs forwarded out of East Prussia some weeks earlier, but seeing 52 of them in close column, 3 abreast, and engines drumming the cobbles, was something else entirely. He went back to his digs that night and wrote a report which, by the time it reached the War Office in early October, had been stamped top secret and circulated to a very small list. Its conclusion was blunt. The Soviets had produced a heavy tank that British anti-tank guns, including the 17-pounder, which had finally given them parity against the Tigers, could not reliably defeat at battlefield ranges. The Centurion, then being rushed into service, mounted a 17-pounder. Britain's newest tank was already obsolescent against a vehicle being driven, in plain sight, past her field marshal. It is one of the quieter scandals of the immediate post-war period that the men in Whitehall who read that paper did not panic. They did something more interesting. Slowly, with the careful parsimony of a treasury simultaneously asked to feed a starving population and demobilize 5 million men, they began to plan a tank that would never have to fight from disadvantage again. A tank that would not match the IS-3 at 1,000 yards. A tank that would kill the IS-3 at 3,000 before its driver had even identified the muzzle flash on the horizon. That tank would be called the Conqueror. It would weigh 65 tons. It would carry a gun the Royal Ordnance factory effectively refined and surpassed from American beginnings. And it would sit on the North German plain for a decade as the Cold War's most over-engineered insurance policy. Soviet planners, when they finally understood what was parked opposite their armoured divisions, did not expect the 120mm L1 to outrange the IS-3 by quite so much. By the time they did understand, the doctrine of the Central Front had already been quietly rewritten in Britain's favour. This is the story of how a bankrupt empire, with rationing still in force and the treasury in despair, built the heaviest gun tank in NATO, and why it mattered far more than its small production run ever suggested. The Britain that began thinking about the IS-3 was not the Britain that had won the war. Within 6 weeks of VE Day, the electorate had thrown Winston Churchill out of number 10 with a landslide so emphatic it shocked observers from Washington to Moscow. Clement Attlee's Labour government arrived in office with a mandate to build a welfare state, nationalise the commanding heights of industry, and grant independence to India. It did not arrive with a mandate to invest in heavy tanks. The fiscal position alone was catastrophic. John Maynard Keynes returned from Washington in autumn 1945 with a loan that bought time but settled nothing. Sterling was overvalued. The dollar gap yawned, and the convertibility crisis of 1947 lay just ahead. Bread rationing, which had been avoided throughout the war itself, was introduced in July 1946. Coal ran out in the appalling winter of January 1947, and the country shivered through power cuts that closed factories and humiliated ministers. Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, told cabinet colleagues bluntly that Britain could no longer carry the responsibilities she still held in Greece, Turkey, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The Truman Doctrine of March 1947 was, in part, a tacit American answer to that British exhaustion. This was not the backdrop against which Whitehall normally commissioned the most expensive battle tanks in Europe. And yet, the strategic landscape was darkening faster than the economic one. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946 articulated what the Chiefs of Staff had already been writing in their internal papers. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired in this period by Harold Kaczia, was producing assessments that drew an increasingly stark picture. Soviet forces in occupied Germany were not standing down. They were re-equipping. By 1947, the Red Army still fielded over 4 million men, and the bulk of its armour was concentrated in the western military districts and in the group of Soviet forces in Germany. The British Army of the Rhine, BAOR, was the thin, khaki line that would have to absorb the first hours of any Soviet thrust westwards. Its commander, General Sir Brian Robertson, had perhaps 4 divisions of varying quality, equipped largely with the wartime kit that had crossed the Rhine in 1945. Comets, Cromwells, a handful of early Centurions. Against the Soviet 8th Guards Army alone, parked across the inner German border at Magdeburg, this was not a defence. It was a tripwire. The Chiefs of Staff knew this. Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook, on the eve of his retirement as CIGS, had warned in his final memoranda that the Red Army was now the principal land threat to Western Europe and would remain so for a generation. His successor, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, now Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, restless, vain, and impossible to ignore, took up the same theme with characteristic energy. Monty had crossed the Reichswald and the Rhine in 1945 and had personally seen what well-handled German heavy tanks could do to British formations from concealed positions at long range. He had no intention of inflicting that experience on his successors in reverse. What the British Army needed, the Chiefs of Staff concluded by 1946, was a 2-tier armoured force. A reliable, mass-producible, medium tank to do the daily work of a battlefield. That role the Centurion was already filling, and filling well. And behind it, a smaller number of heavy gun tanks, specialists, long-range killers parked in reserve or on dominating ground, whose job was to engage Soviet heavies at distances where the Soviet guns could not effectively reply. The Treasury was horrified. The empire was unraveling. Palestine, India, Malaya, Greece, all crying out for resources. Public opinion wanted houses, not howitzers, but the general staff requirement was beginning to take shape on paper at Chertsey, in the offices of the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment, and it would not be denied. The number on the file was FV200. The FV200 series began life as one of the more ambitious bureaucratic fantasies in British defence history, a single universal chassis that would mother an entire family of armoured vehicles. Bridge layers, recovery vehicles, self-propelled guns, command tanks, and at the heart of it all, a heavy gun tank designated FV201, intended to mount a 20-pounder rifled gun on a chassis weighing some 50 tons. Sir Claude Gibb, the Director General of Weapon Production, signed off the initial concept work in 1946. The lead design authority was the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey, with English Electric at Stevenage penciled in to build the thing once the drawings were ready. The problem became apparent within 18 months. The Centurion, which Vickers and the Royal Ordnance factories were already producing in volume, had absorbed the 20-pounder by 1948. Suddenly, the FV201's headline armament was no advance at all. To justify a heavier, more expensive, slower vehicle, the General Staff would have to up the ante decisively. They would have to find a gun the Centurion could not carry. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were wrestling with the same problem from the other end. Their answer, the T-43 prototype that would eventually become the M103, used a 120mm gun derived from the wartime M1 anti-aircraft weapon. British officers from the Ministry of Supply, including Major General Sir Stuart Rawlins, examined the American work closely. They liked the caliber. They did not like the gun. The American piece was a converted flak round, optimized for high explosive performance against aircraft, not the long rod armor-piercing performance required to defeat heavily sloped Soviet armor at extreme range. So the Royal Ordnance factory at Nottingham set out to do what British gun designers had done repeatedly throughout the war: take an American base, refine it ruthlessly, and produce something better. The result, after years of patient work at Fort Halstead and on the proving ranges at Sennybridge, was the Ordnance QF 120mm Tank L1, a rifled gun of substantial length and remarkable accuracy, firing a separate loading round whose armor-piercing discarding sabot projectile left the muzzle at over 4,700 feet per second. The rifling profile, with its specific twist, designed to stabilize long rod projectiles, was patented by the Royal Ordnance and remained a closely held British asset for 2 decades. On paper, and very quickly on the proving ground, the L1 could defeat any known Soviet armor, including the IS-3, at ranges in excess of 2,000 yards. With the later development of fin-stabilized rounds, the effective engagement envelope stretched further still. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Iosif Stalin III was being joined by its larger cousin, the T-10. The T-10 mounted a refined 122mm M62 gun. It was a fine weapon. The Soviets were never less than serious about gunnery, but it was hampered by a slow rate of fire, a separate loading round, and limited optical equipment. Its effective engagement range against a hull-down target, at the levels of precision required to kill rather than merely range on the first shot, was meaningfully shorter than what British engineers were quietly designing into the L1. The decision to abandon the FV201 in favour of a redesigned, larger vehicle mounting the new 120mm gun was taken in 1949. The new designation was FV214. The name was Conqueror, chosen, with that British weakness for sledgehammer nomenclature, to leave no one in doubt about the intended purpose. What the Conqueror still required was a fire control system worthy of its gun. Long-range gunnery is a problem of optics, ballistics, and time. A gun that can theoretically hit at 3,000 yards is useless if the commander cannot find, identify, range, and engage a target before that target moves, fires, or disappears into smoke. The answer, when it came, was unusual, expensive, and quite brilliant. It was called the Fire Control Turret, and it would change the rules. The Fire Control Turret was, in its way, the most distinctively British thing about the Conqueror. It sat atop the main turret, a small armoured cupola of its own, and inside it sat the tank commander, equipped with his own coincidence rangefinder, his own optical sight, his own traversing gear, and, crucially, the ability to engage targets independently of his gunner below. The principle was simple, and in 1949 quietly revolutionary. The commander would acquire a target, range it precisely, slew his cupola onto it, and then hand the target down to the gunner, whose own sights would follow the cupola's bearing. The gunner, in effect, had his weapon delivered onto the target before he had even seen it himself. While he engaged, the commander was already finding the next target. For long-range tank duels, exactly the kind the General Staff anticipated against Soviet heavies in the rolling country between the Weser and the Elbe. This was a force multiplier of the first order. A Centurion crew, however well drilled, could engage perhaps one target every 20 seconds. A Conqueror crew, with the commander hunting ahead of the gunner, could in theory engage 2 or 3 in the same period, at greater ranges, with higher first-round hit probabilities. The system was called Hunter-Killer in the gunnery schools, and the doctrine survives in modern British armour to this day. There was, of course, a price. The fire control turret added height, weight, complexity, and cost. It required a coincidence rangefinder of optical quality manufactured at the Royal Aircraft Establishment Specialist Shop at Farnborough, with a precision that had previously been reserved for naval gunnery on capital ships. It required hydraulic and electrical systems that pushed the limits of 1950s technology. Maintenance crews at Fallingbostel learned to dread the FCT's hydraulic seals, which leaked in cold weather and required specialized tools that BAOR fitters cursed at length and with feeling. And the commander's workload, riding in his own little turret atop the main one, was punishing. But on the gunnery ranges at Lulworth and later at Hohn in West Germany, the results spoke for themselves. Conqueror crews scored consistent first-round hits at ranges where Centurion crews were still ranging in. The first pilot vehicles rolled out of the Royal Ordnance factory at Dalmuir on the Clyde in 1955. The production batch, never large, never intended to be large, followed from the same works and from Vickers at Elswick. The full designation was Tank, Heavy, Number 1, 120mm gun, Conqueror, Mark I. Later, marks would follow. The hull was massive, nearly 38 feet long with the gun forward, 11 feet wide, and tipping the scales at 65 long tons. The Rolls-Royce Meteor M120 petrol engine, a development of the wartime Merlin aero engine that had powered the Spitfire, laboured to push it along at 22 miles per hour on a good road and rather less across country. Fuel consumption was, by any measure, alarming. The first Conquerors were posted to BAOR in 1956. Most went to the 7th Royal Tank Regiment and to the heavy squadrons of the 4th, 5th, and 6th Royal Tank Regiments deployed in the Hanover and Münster areas. 3 Conquerors were typically attached to each Centurion-equipped armoured regiment, parked at the back of the formation, their long guns angled over the heads of the lighter tanks ahead, like artillery in a Napoleonic line. In Moscow, Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, was paying attention. Reports from agents in West Germany and from open source examination of the British military press, began to converge on a worrying conclusion. The British had not merely built a heavy tank, they had built a long-range sniper. And nobody in Moscow's General Staff Academy had yet worked out what to do about it. The reports went up the chain. The answers, when they came, would take years to formulate and longer still to deploy. The confrontation was, paradoxically, one that never happened. The Conqueror's War was a war of training exercises, gunnery camps, and silent vigil along the inner German border. A war fought in the language of Soviet planning maps and NATO defense studies rather than in the language of actual battle. And that, on examination, was precisely the point. Hohne Ranges, Lower Saxony, autumn 1957. A squadron of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment had moved up from its barracks at Fallingbostel for its annual gunnery camp. The weather was filthy, low cloud, drifting rain, visibility cutting in and out. And the targets were a series of hulks set out at ranges from 1,000 to 3,000 yards on the heathland. Among the targets, by deliberate arrangement of the gunnery wing, were captured German turrets and silhouettes scaled to represent Soviet heavy tanks. The IS-3 silhouette was specifically marked in white paint for the avoidance of doubt. A Conqueror commander, sealed into his fire control turret with his rangefinder eyepieces pressed to his face, ranged a target at 2,750 yards. He passed the engagement down to his gunner with the standard call, "Target tank, 2750, on," and the main armament traversed. The first round, an armor-piercing discarding sabot, left the L1 with a concussion that observers a mile away described as physical, not merely audible. The round struck. The umpires confirmed a kill. The commander was already on the next target. This was the moment, multiplied across hundreds of crew hours of training between 1956 and 1966, that the Soviet General Staff had to plan against. Their best estimates of British heavy tank gunnery, drawn from GRU reports, attaché observations, and the careful debriefing of returning visitors, suggested that a Conqueror squadron deployed on dominating ground in the Lüneburg Heath or the rolling country east of Paderborn could engage Soviet heavy armor at ranges where Soviet return fire would be largely ineffective. The mathematics were grim for Moscow. A Soviet tank regiment advancing across the North German plain could expect to lose its lead vehicles to long-range Conqueror fire before its own guns could even credibly range the source. Soviet doctrine, articulated at the Frunze Military Academy and refined throughout the 1950s, depended on speed, mass, and the willingness to absorb casualties in the opening phase of an offensive. The Conqueror threatened to make those casualties unsupportable. Not because there were many Conquerors, there were not, but because a single squadron, well positioned, could disorder the lead echelon of a Soviet thrust and force it to slow, deploy, and engage on British terms. British attachés in Moscow, including the defense attaché at the embassy on Sofiskaya Embankment, noted from the late 1950s onwards a quiet shift in Soviet armored thinking. The T-10M, the final development of the heavy tank line, received improved fire control and stabilization. New anti-tank guided missile programs accelerated. And, significantly, the Soviet emphasis began to migrate away from heavy tanks altogether towards faster, lighter vehicles like the T-62 and T-64, designed to close the range before British gunnery could be brought decisively to bear. This was the Conqueror's actual victory. It did not destroy IS-3s on a battlefield. It made the Soviet General Staff stop investing in IS-3s and in IS-3 successors as the cutting edge of their armored fist. By the time the last T-10s rolled off the line in Chelyabinsk in 1966, the Soviet heavy tank as a category was effectively finished. The Conqueror had not fired a shot in anger, but its presence had quietly rewritten an entire chapter of Soviet doctrine. The price of that achievement, when it was tallied in Whitehall, was steeper than the Treasury liked to admit, and rather more substantial than most of its political masters were ever told. The Treasury's bill, when it arrived in installments throughout the 1950s, was substantial. Each Conqueror cost in the region of £45,000, roughly 3 times the price of a Centurion of the same vintage, and at a time when a new semi-detached house in the home counties could be had for under £2,000. The total programme, including spares, fire control, training, and the specialised recovery vehicles required to drag a 65-ton tank out of soft German ground when it bogged, ran into many millions. For a country that had only just removed sweet rationing in 1953, this was real money. And there were cabinet ministers prepared to say so. And the production run, by the standards of any major fighting vehicle, was tiny. 185 Conquerors were built. Compared to the thousands of Centurions, or the tens of thousands of T-54/55s rolling out of Soviet plants in the same decade, the Conqueror was a boutique weapon. It was meant to be. The doctrine was always about specialist overmatch, not mass. But the small numbers made each vehicle disproportionately precious and disproportionately exposed when something went wrong. Things went wrong with predictable regularity. The Meteor engine, descended from a Spitfire's beating heart, had been designed for an aircraft cruising at a steady throttle setting. Bolted into a 65-ton tank that ground its way across boggy German training areas at low speeds and high loads, it laboured. Fuel consumption was extraordinary. The Conqueror could empty its 220-gallon tanks in under 100 miles of cross-country movement. The transmission, a Z51R epicyclic unit, had a reputation in BAOR, fitter sheds that ranged from demanding to unprintable. The running gear suffered. Track life was short. Tow bars were a routine sight. Crew complaints were robust and consistent. The Conqueror's silhouette was enormous, over 10 feet to the top of the fire control turret. And crews on exercise muttered that they felt like they were driving a cathedral across the Lüneburg Heath. The commander's workload in the FCT, particularly in cold weather, was punishing. Ventilation was poor. The fighting compartment, dominated by the separate loading 120mm ammunition, was cramped. NCOs at the Royal Armoured Corps Centre at Bovington produced earnest training pamphlets on how to load the gun without breaking one's back, and they were widely ignored. The trade of Conqueror loader became briefly a small but distinct subculture of large men with bad lumbar regions. Even regimental sergeant majors of the Royal Tank Regiment, men not given to public sentiment, were heard to mutter about the unloved hugeness of the thing. Politically, the cost was more diffuse, but no less real. The Conqueror programme was one of several capital projects that Whitehall could point to in the late 1950s as evidence of why the defence budget could not be cut further, even as the empire receded and the Suez humiliation of 1956 reduced Britain's pretensions to a global military role. Sir Anthony Eden's resignation, Harold Macmillan's Wind of Change, and the 1957 Defence White Paper produced by Duncan Sandys, which famously prioritised nuclear deterrence over conventional forces, all squeezed the conventional army. The Conqueror, already in service, survived, but its successor was never going to be a still heavier specialist tank. The political appetite for that was gone. There was, too, a lesson learned in intelligence. The 1945 Berlin shock, the IS-3 appearing without warning, had driven the entire program. By the late 1950s, the Joint Intelligence Committee had improved its coverage of Soviet armor development significantly. The next generation of Soviet tanks, the T-62 and its successors, would not surprise Whitehall the way the IS-3 had surprised Montgomery. The Conqueror had been, in part, the price of an intelligence failure. The price was worth it. But Whitehall was determined that it would not be paid again. By the early 1960s, the strategic logic that had produced the Conqueror was changing under Whitehall's feet. The Soviet shift away from heavy tanks, accelerated by Khrushchev's enthusiasm for missiles over armor, meant that the specific target the L-1 had been built to defeat was disappearing from the Soviet order of battle. The IS-3, once the silhouette that had haunted British intelligence assessments, was being relegated to second-line units, then to reserve, then, by the mid-1960s, to the export market and the parade ground in Cairo, Damascus, and lesser capitals still. What was emerging in its place, however, was no consolation. The T-62, entering Soviet service from 1961, mounted a 115mm smoothbore gun that fired the first generation of armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds. A PFS-DS, a technology Britain had been studying since the war and would later perfect, promised to defeat heavy armor at long ranges using kinetic energy rather than caliber alone. The Conqueror, designed to overmatch a generation of Soviet heavies, was about to be confronted by a generation of Soviet mediums that could engage at ranges approaching its own. The British response was already on the drawing board at Chobham. Its working designation was FV4201, and it would emerge as the Chieftain, the most influential British tank of the Cold War. The Chieftain abandoned the two-tank doctrine that had given rise to the Conqueror. It was a single main battle tank carrying the new 120mm L-11 rifled gun, a more powerful piece than the L-1 in every measurable metric, in a hull weighing under 55 tons. Sir Solly Zuckerman, the government's chief scientific advisor, contributed to the technical review that confirmed the Chieftain's superiority across the board. Crucially, the new design kept the fire control turret doctrine, the commander's independent sight, the hunter-killer principle, that the Conqueror had pioneered. The Conqueror itself began to come out of service in 1962 and was fully withdrawn from BAOR by 1966. The withdrawal was undramatic. There were no public ceremonies. The tanks were quietly returned to depots, stripped of useful components, and either scrapped or sent to ranges as hard targets. A small number went to regimental museums. Bovington has one to this day, parked on the indoor display floor, where visitors still circle it with the slightly stunned expression of people who had not realized tanks could be that big. The special relationship had a quieter role in the story than is sometimes suggested. The Americans had developed their own heavy tank, the M103, in parallel with the Conqueror, and the two programs had cross-pollinated in modest, unsentimental ways. American observers attended Hohner. British officers were attached to the Aberdeen Proving Ground. The 120mm L1 round was, by deliberate Anglo-American arrangement, broadly interchangeable in concept with the American 120mm stock, even if specific cartridges differed. When the Chieftain's L11 gun later became the basis for the German Leopard 2's rifled gun variant studies and indirectly informed the American Abrams's 120mm smoothbore selection in the late 1970s, the lineage ran back to the Conqueror's foundational logic, that NATO armor would win not by matching the Warsaw Pact in numbers, but by killing it from further away. For BAOR itself, the doctrinal shift was more profound than the equipment change. The Conqueror years had taught the Royal Armoured Corps to think in terms of overmatch and long-range engagement. That habit of mind, embedded in the gunnery schools at Lulworth and Bovington, did not leave with the tanks. It went into the Chieftain, then into the Challenger 1 that fought in the Gulf in 1991, then into the Challenger 2 that operated in Iraq from 2003. Each generation was the inheritor of a doctrine first written in the late 1940s against the silhouette of a Soviet heavy tank rolling past the Brandenburg Gate. The Conqueror's legacy is hidden in plain sight. There is no famous battle to remember it by, no Conqueror Day, no painted regimental memorial in some Wiltshire chapel. Its dead are the Soviet tanks that were never built, the offensives that were never launched, the doctrine that was rewritten in Moscow under quiet British pressure. That is a strange kind of monument and a peculiarly British one. There is something characteristic in the whole story. A country technically bankrupt, with its empire dissolving and its public exhausted, nonetheless commits to building the heaviest, most expensive, most overspecified gun tank in NATO. Because the General Staff judged, correctly, that the alternative was to fight at a disadvantage Britain could not politically or militarily afford. The Treasury did not like it. The Cabinet, in successive incarnations from Attlee through Churchill, Eden, and Macmillan, did not love it. The crews, in some respects, hated it. And yet it was built, fielded, and quietly kept ready for 10 years until its purpose had been achieved. That is the British way of doing strategy, in its purest form, not the grand offensive, not the mass army, not the headline victory. The careful, expensive, slightly cussed insistence on overmatch at the decisive point. The long gun, the cool commander, the patient sight picture from a hold-down position on the Lüneburg Heath, with the Soviet horizon a long way off and getting closer. The Conqueror also tells us something about the shape of the Cold War as Britain experienced it. The special relationship was real, but it did not dictate every weapon. The Americans had the M103. Britain had her own answer and her own gun. The doctrine of long-range overmatch that runs through the Centurion's later marks, the Conqueror, the Chieftain, the Challenger 1, and the Challenger 2, is recognizably British in its character. Patient, technically conservative, gunnery-obsessed, and unwilling to sacrifice protection or firepower for the sake of mobility. When Challenger 2s engaged Iraqi T-72s at over 3 miles in March 2003, hitting first time in driving rain, the doctrine being applied had been written 60 years earlier on the back of a Berlin intelligence report. It tells us, too, about the limits of Britain's post-war power. The Conqueror could not have been built in the numbers required to defend the entire Central Front alone. It depended on NATO, on the German Federal Republic's recovering forces, on the Americans across the Atlantic. Britain was, by the 1950s, a junior partner in a continental defense she had until recently led. But she was a junior partner with specific, sharp-edged capabilities that nobody else quite duplicated. The Conqueror was one of those edges. So, in a quieter way, was the V-bomber force. So was the Special Air Service. So were the long, careful files of the Joint Intelligence Committee at Storey's Gate. What remains of the Conqueror today is largely museum hardware. Bovington's example, a few hulks on training ranges, the occasional turret cut up for armour testing at Chertsey's successor establishments. But the doctrine is alive in every Challenger 3 currently being delivered to the Royal Armoured Corps. The 120mm gun is now smoothbore. The fire control is digital. The commander's hunter-killer sight has displays that would have astonished a 1956 Conqueror crew. The principle is unchanged. Find the enemy first, range him precisely, kill him before he kills you. Do it from further away than he can credibly reply. If you found this story compelling, give the video a like and consider subscribing. There is a great deal more in this vein to come. Tell me in the comments below, was the Conqueror's tiny production run worth the cost, or should Britain have invested in more Centurions instead? I read every reply.